Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Forget the power of technology and science, for so much has been forgotten, never to be relearned. Forget the promise of progress and understanding, for in the grimdark future there is only war. There is no peace amongst the stars, only an eternity of carnage and slaughter, and the laughter of thirsting gods.
Welcome to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast. The podcast for writers by writers, because sometimes we feel like pros and sometimes we feel like cons. Wow. Joining me this week are Alex, Crusher of Skulls, Eldridge, Phoenix, Blood Drinker, Raig.
That's me.
James, Lord of Shadows, Healy.
How's it going?
And Matan, Ruinbringer, Elul.
Wow. I'm still on thirsting gods. Wow,
that was some Cthulhu shit.
Wow. Well, that was some Grimdark shit specifically, because this week we are diving into the subgenre that is Grimdark. Something that I personally love. That's well, it's a term that a lot of people know, and we'll get into it. Now, before we jump into the subject at hand in all its grimness and its darkness, let's go around the table and see what you guys have been reading or writing or watching. Alex, what have you been up to, man?
Yeah, I've been about as far from you can get from Grimdark. I've just been continuing to watch Fruits Basket with my girlfriend, which is an amazing anime. It's very melodramatic, but also really, really good long form character studies, and like a lot of characters. It's what do they call it? It's an ensemble sort of thing. So I've been going through that. That's been really good. It's just a very good journey. I'm glad Ali's here because she's like, that anime is piss, which is fine. But I really like it, and yeah, I'm going through it.
Beautiful. James, what have you been up to, man?
I just read The Passenger by Cormac McCarthy.
Yeah, okay. I've been wanting to read that.
Yeah, it's good. I think it'll be right up your alley. Kind of feel like if I was to try to describe the storyline, it's almost not really about anything. It's kind of you kind of get sucked into the themes and into the conversations that are going on between the people, and you kind of start to gain a little bit of an understanding of what the vibe is. But yeah, it's a classic. Just a great Cormac McCarthy piece of writing. Really enjoyed it.
And there's a companion book to that as well, right? Called Stella Maris. Yeah, I believe it's one of two, and he released them both at the same time.
Okay, because there's a lot of stuff left unanswered in The Passenger, so maybe that one will. Maybe they tie together. What's the other one called?
Stella Maris, I think.
Stella Maris. Okay, I'll definitely check that out.
Very nice. Matan, what have you been up to?
You guys know the actor Ethan Hawke?
Yeah.
Yes.
I know the name.
Yeah, you know, he had the movie, was it Black Mask? What was it? The horror movie recently?
Yes, I saw it. The Black Phone.
He's on Training Day, exactly, the Black Phone. Yeah, he's an actor. Apparently the guy writes books, and I just got one of them. And check it out. It's called Rules for a Night.
Huh.
Okay. I know, right? It's just literally a manual on how to behave as a person who wants to be a knight.
Cool.
But it's kind of modern.
I
like it. And it's so sweet and cute. And it's like, be honest. Everybody deserves the truth from you. And it's like, yes, I think I should do that. So after I'll complete my education, I'll let you guys know.
Okay. So it's kind of like resurrecting ideals of medieval chivalry for the 21st century?
I like that.
I'd say that's very accurate, Paddy. That's exactly what it is. I wish I said
that. That sounds really interesting. Thank you, Ethan Hawke. All right, let us know how that goes. Phoenix, what have you been reading?
I just finished Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets by J.K. Rowling. That was my first time I finished a book in Spanish, and I started so that felt like a monument. And then I started the fourth one, and I started to bump up against the wall where I'm like, I mean, I'm liking this because it's Harry Potter, but now I'm kind of just reading Harry Potter again. Like I kind of passed a line where I could understand it well enough to a point where I was just reading Harry Potter again. I was like kind of wanting more from the language. So my partner surprised me with this book. Más allá del invierno, which just means beyond winter. And it's by Isabel Allende. And it's the first book I'm reading that's it was originally written in Spanish. It's not a translation. And the author is actually Chilean as well. And it's pretty amazing. It's the first time I've connected with the language on like while reading it, where like I found poetry in it and I was like, whoa, that's beautiful, and I could connect with that sensation and stuff. So
Nice.
it's really cool. It's very cool.
Yeah, that must feel like a real leveling up in your Spanish skills, right?
It does. It really does. It's very satisfying.
Beautiful.
More difficult, obviously, because it's like I've never read this book, so I have no context. So I'm reading and I have to look up words because it's like the vocabulary is bigger as well. It's not a YA book, stuff like that. So beautiful challenge. Really cool.
You should take a stab at some of the Spanish language magical realism at some point, like in its native language.
True.
100 Years of Solitude.
Very true. I read it in English. I forgot that. Was that a native Spanish book?
I
know
think
the author
so.
was.
It's from a Colombian author.
That's right.
Garcia
Oh,
Marquez.
man. That was a hectic one to read in English.
That's kind of grimdark. It's like magical realism grimdark.
I'm writing it down.
Oh.
Yeah, that's me. Other than that, I've just been watching a lot of anime.
Very nice. Very nice. I have been playing a really, really interesting cosmic horror game. It's kind of like an interactive book in that it's not, you don't like shoot things, or it doesn't involve reflexes. It's called Stars Die. It's really hard to describe without giving anything away, but if you're interested in cosmic horror and you're interested in games as literature, check out Stars Die. It's from a small developer. He made it on a shoestring budget, but it's incredible. Really deals with some very interesting existential and ideological questions, which very good.
Very into that.
Awesome.
Speaking of existential and ideological, so today we're jumping into Grimdark, which can be regarded as a subgenre of speculative fiction that is, in broad strokes, dark, despairing, violent, morally grey, and where suffering and a sort of self-perpetuating bleakness form both the backdrop and foreground. I was going to say foreground, backdrop and foreground of the story. Grimdark. Now, is this a term that you guys are broadly familiar with? Have you heard the word Grimdark being bandied around?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's familiar. It's in the lexicon. It's sort of like, when things are really nasty and dark. I mean, I kind of get it confused with low fantasy a bit, which I know is something a bit different. But the idea that the one that everyone always tells me about, which is YA Grimdark, I believe, is the Poppy War. People are like, that is just the brutalest of brutal, and that's like YA Grimdark. But that
gets mentioned a lot.
Yeah, that's about as far as my understanding of it really goes.
I had not really, like, you threw it out there and it felt like a word I do know. It's like I know both of the words, like grim dark. I'm like, oh yeah, grim dark, but I didn't actually really know what it was, so I had to look it up before this. And then I had a fun mental exercise of thinking of examples of what I'd consider that. But no, my familiarity before this was not a conscious familiarity.
Matan, James?
Yeah, I think the definition there that you used can like apply to a lot of things, but whenever I've heard it used for stuff that like really leans into just despairing, bleak stuff, and it's often thrown around as almost a condemnation of like a certain type of story, where it's kind of like, what was the point of that? That was just grimdark.
It is often used as a pejorative,
but then
which we'll get to.
Horror porn.
Yeah, when you kind of consider the definition, and you consider the stories that a lot of the stories that have it, a lot of stories that's used in, it actually applies to a lot much wider type of story and much wider genre of science fiction and fantasy. So
I feel like following what James said, I feel like grimdark is kind of the answer to traditional fantasy. Could be in sci-fi too, but when I think grimdark, I personally think about A Song of Ice and Fire, widely known as Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
I think about The Sword Itself by Joe Abercrombie. And I think about these stories that feel like a reaction that has been years in the making to the authors like Tolkien and even C.S. Lewis, and like this traditional, hopeful, idealistic fantasy where your hero can basically behead an orc one moment and then be the ideal of hope and just and the good way and nobility. And there's this almost partition between, okay, yeah, he's wielding a sword and he just probably chopped down 10 goblins, but he's a really nice guy and he's not a monster, and the question doesn't even rise. Whereas Grimdark is like, to be a killer, you're a killer all the time. You're not a killer just when you're facing the goblins or the orcs. You're a killer, and you know what? You probably kill humans too. And I like that counter. And I think every genre has that cycle where it starts, then there's this subversion of the genre, and then there's the parody. I do think we're towards the end of the Grimdark cycle, but I'll leave that for later. But in short, that's what I think about it.
That's definitely something I want to touch on is, are we still on this trajectory of things becoming increasingly darker and grittier? Looking at you, Batman. Or are we starting to move out of it? Has it always been around? And it's just like we just are focusing now on certain pieces of media. But interesting that you say Matan, that you talk about it as a reaction to Tolkien. You know, this is a high quality podcast when we go to Wikipedia for our definitions. Sci-fi and fantasy novelist Adam Roberts described it as fiction where nobody is honorable and might is right. And according to him, Grimdark is an anti-Tolkien approach to fantasy writing. I think a few of you guys said, like, it seems like it's something that it shouldn't just be speculative fiction.
It's reactionary.
Grimdark is one of those really broad things that has a lot of definitions. There's a lot of back and forth on it. So there's a few different ways we can talk about it. But it's often associated specifically with fantasy or with science fiction. And he actually considers George R.R. Martin's fantasy series A Song of Ice and Fire as Grimdark, which he sees as a reaction to Tolkien's idealism. I don't know that I'd agree that it's Grimdark, but I haven't actually read the books beyond the first one. You're looking at me, Matan, like, what are you talking about?
No. I think that, Game of Thrones has been in the public psyche for so long that I think it's completely normal to not see it as Grimdark, especially if you watch the TV show and seasons 7 and 8 kind of diverted from what made the show what it is.
I
for
guess
better or worse.
The thing is, there's always grimmer and there's always darker. So, but we'll get to that.
I think two of the main, two of the main definitions of Grimdark is that it's morally ambiguous. Like the characters are morally ambiguous, and then the theme of the story ends up being morally ambiguous. So where it's different from Tolkien's is that there was a very clear good and a very clear bad, a very clear light and very clear darkness. Whereas in Game of Thrones, it wavered. There was no clear line of what was right and wrong. So the setup of the world is almost that the world is a bad place, and in order for the characters to live in it, they must do things that are bad, and you can't necessarily. They must do things that we would consider morally bad, but then the context of the world makes it less clear cut. So I think that's, maybe you'd call it Grimdark light, but I think that's one of the main definitions of what a Grimdark story would be.
Yeah, I think that's quite legit. Going back to the definitions, historian and critic Liz Burke considers Grimdark's defining characteristics to be, quote, a retreat into the valorization of darkness for darkness's sake, into a kind of nihilism that portrays right action as either impossible or futile. This, according to her, has the effect of absolving the protagonists as well as the reader from moral responsibility, which I think is interesting. We mentioned very briefly that Grimdark is often used as a pejorative, and it's sometimes described as kind of misery porn. And it is the kind of thing you can read where you want everything to be as dark as possible. You don't want there to be moral answers because perhaps you see a kind of nihilism in the world. We don't live in a world of good and evil, therefore I don't want my fiction to reflect any kind of real moral point. Everyone's bad, everyone's at fault. That's certainly one take.
Yeah, it's sort of like the fiction of moral relativism, really.
I think that's a really good way of putting it.
Everything's up for grabs because inherently everything is broken, you know?
Just to touch on the misery porn thing, I think it really depends on your protagonist, because a protagonist that doesn't adjust to the world, that kind of story would be misery porn, because they don't know how to handle this world and they'll constantly be abused. But if you have a protagonist that does understand the rules of the game and does show the initiative to go by them, it doesn't have to be that kind of story. It can be a story of a morally gray protagonist who breaks the rules because might is right, and that's the only way to go. It can go several ways, I think.
Yeah, and what I actually don't like about Liz Burke's criticism is I think that often, not always, Grimdark is itself a pretty scathing criticism of cycles of violence and deep moral relativism that says that nothing is right or wrong. Though it definitely depends on the example we're looking at. According to academic and game designer John Garand, and he's number 3 of the Wikipedia examples, Grimdark is associated with the Gothic movement of the 90s, with its negativity and emphasis on loss. The term itself came from the early 90s, and the early 90s was when we saw like the Gothic arise, Gothic subculture arise. And what's interesting is it comes after the high point of the 80s, which is really optimistic, everything's going to be okay, and then we get some economic recession, and then boom, we get goths. Now, online searches for Grimdark will inevitably come up with just as much, if not more, content around games, be they tabletop or video games, as they will books and films. Like I mentioned, that guy John Garand himself is a game designer, and he has a lot to say on Grimdark. And this is because the term Grimdark itself derived from the tagline of the tabletop wargame Warhammer 40,000. To quote, "In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war." Now, that quote I read out at the beginning is actually from one of Warhammer 40,000's many, many rule books. Forget the power of technology and science. So much has been forgotten. Blah, 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 blah. Warhammer 40,000 often regarded as sort of the archetypal grimdark work. If you're not familiar with the Warhammer 40,000 universe, this is a quick summary of what it's about. Humanity in the far future is locked into a never-ending state of total war, where untold billions suffer and die under a totalitarian empire that knows only warfare, mass production, and slavish devotion to a single god emperor. Science and social progress have ground to a standstill, and in many cases, regressed to near medieval levels. And the whole vibe is that things are actually going to get a whole lot worse before they ever get better. Needless to say, it's a fairly bleak place to live. In John Garand's essay, Endless 90s, The Perennial Aesthetic, he said that the early 90s saw a crystallization in gaming aesthetics, with tabletop games like Warhammer 40,000 and Vampire the Masquerade, as well as video games like Doom and Alone in the Dark, establishing a dark tone that would become a staple from that point forwards. What do they all have in common? Well, he claims that at their core, they're all really Gothic, and they all come out of Gothic culture. Dabbling in the supernatural, a lot of darkness, a lot of violence, kind of reveling in a bleakness, which wasn't necessarily there in mainstream media before. It's kind of no surprise that if Grimdark as a concept did originate with video games, that today we're getting things like The Matrix and The Poppy War, and the never-ending series of Batman films that only seem to get darker and grittier. The people that grew up with these video games and these kind of influences became writers and filmmakers, and the people that would then start to define fiction. And their tastes obviously were in part influenced by that early Grimdark strain. It seems like Grimdark is almost a celebration of, like a kind of rolling around in themes of despair, loneliness, violence, and or unrelenting darkness. However, trying to define exactly what would constitute Grimdark as a subgenre has been pretty elusive and pretty contentious. According to Grimdark magazine, yes, there is actually a Grimdark magazine. People love this stuff. I might actually subscribe, having read a little bit of their stuff. Mm-hmm. It's a periodic publication on fiction that is both grim and dark. Ask 10 Grimdark fantasy fans what their definition of Grimdark is, and you're likely to get 10 marginally, if not wildly different answers. However, ask them for a top 10 list, and by this they mean a list of the top 10 biggest grimdark fantasy works, and you can all but guarantee the same small stack of male authors will dominate. And it's interesting that it is all male authors. Yeah, some of the works include The Poppy War, which we just mentioned by R.F. Kuang, Prince of Thorns by Mark Lawrence, and The Grim Company by Luke Skull. I gotta say, I actually haven't read any of those books. I don't know if any of you guys know any of them.
His name is Luke Skull, like skull.
It's actually Skull, SCULL.
Okay. Because I thought, wow, that's commitment to the genre.
It's kind of perfect.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe he changed his name to be more fitting. Have you guys read any books that you would describe as grimdark based on?
Yeah. Sorry, Paddy. Sorry, I didn't.
No,
go
ahead.
Excited. Yes. So, as anyone who's listened to the podcast more than once knows, me and James are both very into horror, and I think there is a big crossover between those two genres. I'm going to cite the most recent, let's say, grimdark book that I read, going through a loose version of the term, was probably the Deep by Nick Cutter, and it is very literally dark. Like there's depictions of physical darkness, like an absence of light. It is several thousand fathoms under. It's in fact in the deepest part of the Mariana Trench, so the deepest possible place you could be in the world. Pretty grim and pretty physically dark. Not a lot of
pretty
light.
literally dark.
Yeah, exactly. There's not.
I've never read anything so literally dark before.
Yeah, no.
That's probably the review.
Yeah, exactly. There is a lot of violence in that book. There's a lot of really weird, spooky things that happen, and the ending, I won't spoil what it is, but the ending is very, very bleak, like exceedingly bleak. And when you finish a book like that, like I judge what a book is based on how it ends. Like I can really enjoy a book like Murakami's Norwegian Wood, but because of the way it ended, I was just like, that was kind of crap. I didn't like that. Just because how it ended. I'm sure people are going to castigate me for that, but whatever. Yeah. So basically the way that ended, I was like, okay, this is a grim, dark novel. This is basically perpetuating the idea that things are hopeless and meaningless, and there is no real way to win, quote unquote. There's just very little to it. So that's my most recent version of it. King does a lot of work in that as well, but not as much, but a little bit, especially with his other author name. So that's my experience.
That's kind of right on the money with grimdark.
I think by definition, a story falls out of the grimdark category if it's also a horror. Because I think that although people would read both types of story for a sense of catharsis, the idea is that you take a step into this world which is either very scary or either very bleak, and then you can still put the book down and go back to your own life, and that kind of gives you a sense of catharsis to read that. I think that they're almost two separate. Well, there's certainly two separate definitions. So I think that if a
very scary or very dark, you mean like those are two different ones?
Yeah, I think if it's a horror story, it's almost a different type of design to it, even if it is a very bleak and depressing story. And often horror stories have terrible outcomes for the characters in the end, and instead of there being a message of hope at the end, there's almost a message of, but it could even be worse. I know all of H.P. Lovecraft's stories ended with there's still worse out there. But then because it's a horror, it has a different vibe. Whereas I think the grimdark is that it's a bleakness and a hopelessness. But they both share the violence and often the moral ambiguity and stuff. I recently read The Survivor by Chuck Palahniuk, which is an extremely grim, dark,
he's a
surreal,
bleak
absurd
guy.
story. He is that and Haunted are such bleak stories. But then towards the end, both of them had glimmers of hope, which left you with a different feeling when you got to the end, where you were sort of just like, you went down into this ugly place, but then there was a message of hope that kind of brought you back up out of it again. And I think a grimdark story doesn't give you that exit. It doesn't.
You only need a little bit.
Say it again.
You only need like the tiniest little bit. Sorry, Phoenix, something.
Yeah, like the tiniest little bit
Nice.
goes a long way. But I think once it gives you that tiny little bit, you're now having a different experience. Well, sorry, Phoenix, did you want to say something?
Oh yeah, no, it's off of what you said, because like when I looked up the definition, I started to think of like what movies I would distinguish as grimdark. My mind went to movies. I haven't read anything. I actually no, I edited one story for someone that I would consider grimdark just because of it was in the zombie genre. And based on the ending, I would say it subverted and slid into grimdark. But the things that I came back with as grimdark were actually, my mind went to the Matrix. And you mentioned the 90s, Paddy. Kind of the Matrix, I would say. I kept thinking after that because I was like, almost. But my mind went to 12 Monkeys, that movie with Brad Pitt. And that's 1996.
Yeah, that's a Terry Gilliam film.
Yeah. Is it?
Yeah.
I believe, yeah. And then my mind went to 9 it was in 2009. It was a computer animated film.
I remember that one, yeah.
I
remember
remember that one too.
Ragdoll
With
person.
Elijah Wood.
Yeah,
right?
Ragdoll.
Yeah.
Yeah, Elijah Wood. And but it was so the thing with the thing I noticed in 9, as well as 12 Monkeys, was the whole time I had a feeling of discomfort because especially with 9, it's like, it's advertised as this kind of, it has like these cool action sequences. It's beautifully animated. Voice acting's amazing. Like all this stuff. It looks like an awesome dystopian film with a really cool concept behind it. But then when you watch the movie, you're thrown into the world very jarringly and you're not given much to hold on to in terms of context. And then things kind of don't get better, really. I haven't seen it in a while, so I can't remember how it ends, but I remember feeling very like, ooh, I was not anticipating feeling like this watching this cool animated movie. And then so the thing that I kind of came out of these examples off of what you said, James, about how horror might be different is because I feel like it's a different technique where, like with grimdark, I feel like that technique with grimdark is you don't want to you're constantly subverting the reader in the sense that you never give them ground to stand on. You don't want them to have that anchor. Whereas you have a lot of dystopian things where you have like, all right, you're kind of looking for that underground hideout. Where's the ragtag team that's going to back me up and give me some sense of safety, some sense of status quo? Where's that moral, subverting Tolkien? It's like, where's that moral like fight that we're going for? And you never really give that to them. You keep pulling it out and then they try something and it goes bad or whatever happens and you consistently subvert. And I was thinking even with horror, it's like kind of in the opposite. You give them a focal point of at least they have something they know they don't want. Like it's like that outcome I don't want. Whereas the other grimdark to me almost feels like it's like a vacuum of it's just bleak.
There's no hope. So there's no exit that the characters are looking for.
Yeah, they're just in there.
Yeah. I think I don't know if you're going to cover this, Paddy, so I'll leave it. I'll skip over it if you're going to get to it later.
No, it's
the opposite of grimdark is called hope punk.
Happy time. Oh,
Happy time.
Say that one more time. Hope what?
Hope punk, and it is any story where obviously there is hope or there is the idea of working together is what will help us, or the idea of fighting back against the evil or the thing that's going wrong. A lot of grimdark stories are in kind of like dystopian settings. So any story that's set in a dystopian setting where the characters are trying to fight against the machine, whether they win or lose, that's a story of hope. It's a story of community working together, trying to fix what's wrong. Whereas a story where the characters have just accepted and are living in this world and they're going along with it, they have been shaped by this world, is then more of a grimdark type of story. So even because the characters are working together to fight in Game of Thrones, it's because there's not a clear sense of who is right and who is wrong. Within that, obviously you have the White Walkers and stuff like that, so that becomes a different vibe. But the idea of certainly the second season and the second book, when everyone is fighting over the throne and no one is necessarily, everyone's reason for doing it is correct in their mind, but then there's no clear line of who is morally right at the end of the day.
In that sense, I totally agree that Game of Thrones seems grimdark. And again, there isn't a set definition, so saying it is or isn't is a matter of opinion. Although I do think Game of Thrones has that kind of light versus darkness element, despite all that, there's still the big, it's almost objectively evil, right? The White Walkers and the dark magic and stuff. Everyone knows what they don't want, and it's that thing over there. And I don't know, maybe all fiction has that to an extent, but to me, there is that still that Tolkienian sense of, but we're still banding together to fight the evil lord, even though we're all kind of morally dubious.
I think it's a little bit more, the vibe in the books is a little bit more.
Again, I haven't read the books.
Yeah. Well, I really remember that he drew attention to how much devastation everyone fighting over the throne caused. Because you have sections where the characters are traveling through the countryside and villages have been destroyed and crop has been burned, and there's just anarchy, like bands of raiders are going around taking what they want. I think there's massive packs of wolves just running wild and devouring people and stuff. So it's just caused complete anarchy. And within all that, there's this concept of the external danger of the White Walkers is still coming, but because we're all fighting each other, we can't deal with that. So whether it is thematically the idea of the other coming in to attack the nation, or even just the idea of fighting against nature because they're coming with the winter and stuff like that. It's the idea of the fact that we're not working together to defeat what we should be defeating, that it creates this sense of hopelessness within that world.
Well, that does sound very grimdark.
I think James described it really, really well, but I just have to say, violence alone does not make a story, in my opinion, grimdark. I think it's really about the trajectory of the plot and of the characters. And I'd like to give as an example a book called Strange the Dreamer by Liani Taylor. Now, I'm sorry I'm jumping into spoiler territories, but within the book, we have a castle in the sky above a village, and regularly the gods come down, kidnap women, rape them, and send them back after a year without their memories, after having used them for reproductive purposes.
It sounds like alien abduction stories, right? Where the aliens come and they probe the hillbilly and they make a clone and...
Exactly. And one of the guys that tries to protect his wife, he loses a hand. Okay, it's pretty dark. But even though this setting is very violent and grim, there's just something hopeful about the story because, like James said, the characters do band together against it. There is a clear realization, this is what we don't want, and this is what we're willing to do against it. And there's a group of characters that understand that this is wrong. And even though we kind of round out the gods towards the end and kind of understand why some of them are the way they are, and it just doesn't feel that dark. The first book ends with a very dark outcome. The second one, however, and it isn't any surprise because of the tone, ends in a pretty positive note. And I just felt it while reading. I kind of knew that it's going to be positive in the end because of the themes and the characters. In fact, I think if the outcome had been terrible, I would feel cheated because the way the story was presented.
I think that's why the genre gets a reputation as being like misery porn, because if there's any little bit of hope or any little bit of pushing back against what's wrong, it no longer is grimdark. So it is sometimes a little bit implausible that there is no one who is defiant or there is no one who is banding together. It's the idea that everyone is just against everyone, and there is no glimmer of an exit, or the sun will come up again, which is often kind of contrived if you're not, you need to justify why it is that way because people aren't naturally like that.
Depends on your perspective. I think a lot of people would say that grimdark is the most realistic way to approach things because actually everything is terrible and humans are essentially
I'm not saying that grimdark isn't realistic. I'm saying that you need to justify why there isn't hope. You need to justify why people aren't working together.
Yeah.
Because I won't get into the philosophy of whether or not we are good or evil or whether or not we work together or not. But if you have pressure coming down on you and a way out of that is to work together, you will work together to get around that. So if you think of something like 1984, they justified, or he
Mhm.
justified in that story, why people didn't work together and how people couldn't work together to defeat it. So it felt plausible.
Yeah.
Whereas if he hadn't justified it in that way, you would have read it and just been like, but why are they going along with this, and why isn't there love, and why isn't there intellectual development and stuff? It was because he justified all of that throughout the story, which is what made it so grim.
I actually have 1984 on my list of
Oh, it's
I
amazing.
mean,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
classic.
it is, and it's grimdark is often called like a fantasy or a science fiction genre, but really I can't think of something more grimdark than 1984. I mean, Warhammer 40,000, right? It's really grim and dark, but it's still, you know, there's wars and there's an outside enemy, et cetera, kind of like Game of Thrones. 1984, there's no hope. It's you look forward to the future and there's no way out. It's unending misery forever.
Yeah.
It's interesting that a lot of grimdark, and actually I think this is one of the defining it's not necessarily a thing, but a lot of grimdark tends to deal with well, let me take it back a second. It seems to me that grimdark very often differs from horror and dark fantasy in that it deals with systemic, institutional, or existential darkness. The grimdark setting isn't just the one that's dark because of a mysterious curse or an evil magician. There may be those things, but that's not why it's dark. What's causing the kingdom to suffer in the grimdark novel is the political and social structures that people live in, and it's because they're human structures. The reason why they're flawed and they cause suffering is because they're made by humans, and humans have foibles and weaknesses that kind of comes into everything we make. It seems like that's part of the grand tragedy of a lot of grimdark. It's like we do this to ourselves. You know, much like Greek tragedies, the whole thing is like the protagonist has the seeds of their undoing inside them from the beginning. That's kind of what grimdark is teaching us, that anything we make is inevitably going to be terrible because we are how we are. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, that's a massive change for, like, when I think of, say, horror, for example, there's always an external factor, and it may be hopeless, that's true, but it doesn't necessarily, it can, but it doesn't necessarily seed that, you know, this catastrophe is coming from an institutionalized, like, you have built this box and now you have trapped yourself inside it and you will suffocate. Like, that's not how horror plays out usually. Like, the sort of
it's almost like by definition you need some light in horror in order for the monster to come in and wreck everything.
In a sense of contrast, you know, like there's always a big bad, and the big bad is outside everyone else. Even if the big bad is a serial killer and is a person, there's always that sense of separation from society, shall we say. They're like, you know, like I don't know, in like Silence of the Lambs, the guy's like he's an insane serial killer who's like working outside of, say, the police force. I mean, even if he was within the police force, it would still be, well, we didn't know, you know. So there's that separation of institutional and external horror or subjugation, I guess. I think that's a really cogent point.
It makes sense to put, like, if you want something to feel really hopeless from a reader point of view, or the reader to feel hopelessness or like bleakness, seeing as our readers are going to be human, it's like, what's one thing that there is no way out of, and that is being human. So if the problem is within human, you can't escape that inevitable. So it creates, like 1984, it's systemic, and so you can't escape. If the problem is humanity, you know, you are human, so
yeah,
you have to sit
like,
with that.
It's like the one thing we can't escape is the fact that we are us.
It's kind of
The real monster was man all along.
That's a book title for you. Oh no, I'm a human.
Oh, it's worth noting that the term grimdark, according to the sources I could find, seems to have originally been pejorative. I think someone mentioned this before, that grimdark is often used as like a criticism, like it's just grimdark trash. That was you, James?
Yeah. Which I don't agree with. I think that's grimdark done wrong. Is what people associate as when they talk about trash.
That's what I would say too.
I think it's so easy to do it wrong if you just sink into, if you misunderstand the genre and you think the genre is just causing your reader pain and shock value, then you're not doing justice to the genre, and you give it a bad name. Because real Grimdark is, like you said, Paddy, is about a system that is the problem. And I think you can tell amazing stories without sinking into just pain.
Yeah, it's like not just like recursively depressing your reader. It's like, okay, I mean, whatever, what's the point of that? I mean, unless that's what you want to do, whatever. But you can artfully use bleakness and these things to communicate some challenging aspects of life to your reader, because there are challenges in life, there is pain innate in life, and to talk about that without sinking into, I would say it can kind of sometimes be I'll say it, like maybe a little bit immature to just like completely just go into depression for depression's sake, or like focus down. And that's not me saying like depression isn't valid or anything. That's a completely different thing. But just like to get your reader to just give them a focal point of depression for the sake of doing it, that doesn't feel artistic or nuanced to me. But to take something that exists in life that can be uncomfortable to sit with and not give the reader a way out of it, to have your reader then sit with it and be with something that's really difficult, that can be beautiful and very impactful.
And you can still have a journey for your character. Your characters can still develop. They have to still go on a journey, and they still have to learn lessons, even in this dark, difficult setting.
Yeah.
Even if the lesson that they learn is that everything is terrible and that there's no light at the end of the tunnel.
I would
looking at you, Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian.
That's exactly. This is literally what I was going to say.
Yeah,
this is literally what was on my mind. But even within, like, as like Phoenix was saying, like there needs to kind of be a point to it. The point to that was almost a speculation on, because it was about characters who were shaped by the world they lived in, but it was then still a speculation, kind of a philosophical speculation on that. But yeah, well put. Definitely, Blood Meridian is grimdark.
Yeah, it really is. In fact, I think some of the most effective grimdarks aren't necessarily in fantasy or sci-fi because they're rooted in the war world. Blood Meridian is about the Glanton gang, who were a real gang of scalp hunters in the late 1800s. James, is that about right?
I
Wild
can tell you.
West.
Yeah. And they were terrible people.
Diabolical.
In fact, I've got some notes on this. Quote, a historical group of scalp hunters who massacred indigenous Americans and others in the United States and Mexico borderlands from 1949 to 1950 for bounty, sadistic pleasure, and eventually out of nihilistic habit. And you know, when you look at history, I think as bad as Game of Thrones is, there's still some events from history that are more grimdark than almost any fiction. Like looking at you, King Leopold II, Belgian Congo, or the history of Haitian sugar plantations. So grimdark as social commentary and criticism of institutions, I don't think is just misery porn. It has some real precedent to draw on. Matan, what were you going to say?
I was just gonna say, first of all, I think indifference throughout history is the real evil. It's not the cackling madman with an axe. It's the 20 people watching and deciding that it's not their business. With that being said,
good.
I'll just say, as far as, because this is a writing podcast, so to any writers, and the first serious book I tried to write was kind of grimdark. I would just say, when you write grimdark, it doesn't absolve you from the normal rules of storytelling. It's not, people are not coming on this journey with you just to see people get beheaded or darkness because they feel like something dark today. You still need to provide a story, nuance if you can, especially emotional one. And I think an early mistake by young writers, new writers, is to just think that the features of the genre are the genre, and that's not true. They're just the things you put around the real story.
Yeah, you want to think of it in terms of what the gestalt of the genre is. What is the genre trying to say? So in this case, say, you know, taking 1984 as an example, I don't know if that's classically grimdark, but let's just use it as
I
such?
don't think it is, but by this definition, it seems like it must be, right?
Okay, well,
From now on, it is.
assuming that
Sure,
for
I
the
think
sake
it
of this
should be.
argument, the one of the first sentences in it, I think there's a quote at the beginning is like, I think it's actually a quote from someone else, and I can't remember who. It's like in the end, mankind will not. It's something like they will become enslaved to themselves, not because they it's forced upon them, but because they beg for it, and that encapsulates the whole essence of it's. I butchered that, but it's something like that.
Oh, that's good.
It encapsulates the whole essence of that book, and the whole point of that book is like we have created this society and funneled ourselves into it. I mean, you could look at it as an example of, say, North Korea right now is in a very similar situation, which is this thing we've made for ourselves, which we now have to live in. And it is the whole book serves to perpetuate that narrative. It's not just like, oh yeah, and then the main protagonist, he had a crush on a girl, but the girl was awful, so she slapped him, and then he fell down a manhole. It's not a series of events that's like, oh, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad. It's like
Never make a move next to a manhole.
you got to look up. You got to look up.
Rookie mistake.
Don't do that.
What is this saying? What's it about?
Safe environment.
And it's about subjugation of an entire society. So what I'm saying is, you have to come with the higher level theme first, as opposed to just being like bad stuff happens.
I quite like that. Well, what do you guys think about the idea of what about works that kind of just do revel in the grimness and the darkness? Because like action movies are just like, let's enjoy Arnold Schwarzenegger mowing down like an army of dudes. Is there anything necessarily wrong in works that... Okay, so one of the big criticisms of when Grimdark is used as a pejorative, it's often because there's a work that's trying to be edgy, right? Dark for the sake of dark. It's like, you don't know me. I refuse to play by your rules. Is there anything necessarily wrong with that, do you think? Do works that are grimdark have to be doing it for a reason, or is it okay to just roll around in the bleakness sometimes?
I think it depends on the intention. I think it really depends on what the intention of the work is. Like, what does it mean to roll around in the bleakness? Why? That's my question. I think there's nothing inherently wrong with it, as long as you have a reason for doing it. And for the sake of doing it, no. I don't think that's a good enough reason. Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think Conan's grimdark, I've read it isn't grimdark at all. It's literally him, like a bunch of guys scheming. This is the first story that I read. It's a bunch of guys scheming like, yeah, we're going to kill the king when he comes into his bedroom. And Conan walks in and is like, nope. And he just kills them all. And it's glorious. It's glorious.
Is he the king?
Yeah, he's the king. And it's like a male power fantasy, if anything. I wouldn't call that grimdark at all. But I know he was very close to H.P. Lovecraft, and we've talked about the difference between grimdark and horror. But so he did have an interest in that darkness and that sense of hopelessness, obviously. But any of the stuff that I've read is not that. I might just not be well enough informed. But no, I think that's almost the opposite.
Paddy, regarding your question, and that Conan thing was cool. Regarding your question, I think any genre, you can take sci-fi, you can take erotic fiction, you can take horror. If you just revel in the horror, in the sex, in the sci-fi, without really having, a spine, a story, a message, a lesson learned, conflict, tension, it's just not going to cut it. Even if you write a sci-fi fiction novel, and all you do is just talk about spaceships and warp travel and these midichlorians and whatever, and it's gonna be boring. The same with the sex book. Even if you just do an erotic fiction that's only sex scenes and nothing else, I promise you, readers are gonna get bored pretty quickly. There has to be something behind it, and the same goes for grimdark. It cannot just be grim and dark.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think grimdark and tragedy can have a little bit in common in that the point of the story can often be like the pathos, like the pity that you feel for the characters, but that requires an awful lot of character development and like a reason for feeling that way. But I think it's very difficult to pull off a story like that without some kind of glimmer of hope and some kind of message of hope within it. Because it sort of feels to me like at the end of the day, what is the point? Once you've read the whole thing and you've gotten to the end and it's just all the way through, you're kind of like, what am I left with at the end of this? What was the point?
Yeah.
You have to have the ability to create character and create tension so that the reader can relate to and feel the subversion of their hope. Otherwise, it doesn't feel like, it's like you almost need to create hope to subvert it to create bleakness. Sometimes, I'm maybe not all the time, but I feel like that's a good method to do it. So yeah, you still have to be good with storytelling tools. If you can't create meaning within your world, then you can't create bleakness because your reader can't relate to what you're saying. It's just like, well, I read this thing you wrote. Yeah. You could do anything you want. In the end, I don't think it's like, you could do anything you want on the paper. It's just in the end, is it going to be good? Is it going to be an experience? Is it going to be anything?
It's going to be a worthwhile experience for somebody else to read it, or is it just going to be punishing?
And when Grimdark gets used as a pejorative, I think it is often applied to works that just seem punishing, where there isn't that level of nuance, etc., etc. What's coming back to Grimdark as a subgenre? What's interesting is it's one of the if it is a subgenre, and maybe it's more of just like a flavor of fiction. But if it is a subgenre, it's got to be one of the few subgenres that an author will almost never apply to themselves. Authors never call themselves Grimdark. In fact, to be called Grimdark actually seems like it's something of slander. I do have a counterexample, though, an author called Anna Smith, who's the author of the Empires of Dust trilogy, and she seems like she is right down rolling around in the term. She has the following very interesting take on Grimdark as a subgenre, etc., etc. And this is actually a quote from an AMA, or an Ask Me Anything, that she did with the fantasy subreddit. To quote Anna Smith, "The Iliad is a work of grimdark fantasy." There's a little bit there where she goes on to say it's the first work of grimdark fantasy, and also coincidentally the first work of I think it's the first work of Western European fiction. Could have that wrong, but her point is that it's very old. To quote her again, she then goes on to say, Matan?
The Iliad is the one, just for our listeners, is that the one when they conquer Troy?
Yeah. That's Achilles and Troy, isn't it?
I don't know if they conquer it, but it's
they do
Troy,
worse, I believe. Yeah.
Probably because it's somewhere for Grimdark. So she goes on to say, seriously, the terrible thrill of violence, the desire for power, this has been a constant of human history. Violence, gendered violence, has been a constant of human history. Fear of the dark, of the monsters out there, and the monsters inside one's house, inside one's own self, has been a constant. People have always told stories that are ambiguous in their attitude to power and to violence, that explore the pleasures and horrors of war. It's interesting that she says the pleasures of war. People have always told stories of demons and dark powers and felt a thrill thinking of themselves wielding such power. Grimdark fantasy is a modern genre dealing with very old things. Well said, I think.
Yeah.
Well said.
I was gonna say, like, if nobody's masquerading as I don't see it as a pejorative at all. Like, if I considered my work grimdark, that's something I would advocate. I would be I don't think it's an easy thing to pull off, to do well.
No, I don't think it is either.
I feel like it's maybe more of a filter than a genre itself. It's like I think you had it when you said flavor, Paddy, like the particular flavor of science fiction or fantasy, or maybe even just historical fiction, if you're talking about, World War II or Vietnam or something, is just like things are going to get bad because we've made them bad. It seems to be the flavor or the essence of what it is, rather than its own sort of thing. I mean, that's just a
yeah. Maybe it's more of just a thematic strain that runs through fiction than a subgenre, right? Anna Smith has some. If you want to check out her AMA, it's really good. I'll just give this one more piece of her talking about Grimdark. To me, Grimdark is distinct from dark fantasy in that it has a very clear political dimension, a narrative cynicism that unpacks ideas like leadership, power, good and evil, and raises some uncomfortable questions about how we're thinking about them. Grimdark asks questions about how power operates and uses fantasy to comment on huge issues of human morality and motivation, asking us to think a bit deeper about what we might do. It's about cynicism, self-criticism. It's actually very much a genre that criticizes and politicizes righteous violence. I'm sold. Yep. Hearing that, I definitely see why she'd want to call herself Grimdark. And actually, I think it's something that I'm really interested in. The reason why I wanted to do this ep is because I love things that look power and institutionalized violence and cycles of misery. I don't know about you guys, but I'm really into that. I don't know if this is like a 21st century thing because the world seems to have so many problems that we're really interested in stuff that deals with this. Phoenix?
I was just gonna say, like, off of what you just read from her AMA, it's like Grimdark done well. I feel like it's an important genre because it is that discomfort. It's that there is no. The world is very objective to the point where there is no we define our right and wrong, and it has, by kind of accepting that truth, you have to really. You author your own truth, and that could be a very uncomfortable thing for people to sit with at times.
I think we do have a reaction to the grimdark of the late 90s and 2000s, and it's sitting right in front of us, and it's a multi-billion industry of superhero. The superhero genre, I think, is a pretty strong counter. Now, you do have the Batman films, which are dark and gritty, in the DC universe, but the DC universe, which has been dark, has kind of failed. What has succeeded, the light and happy and jumpy superhero movies with a lot of colors, and the good guys win, and it kind of shows you the different generations.
I think you were talking about how is going out, or it could go out.
I think it is
very interesting.
I think it is going out. I think it's the natural progression that eventually, especially after 8 seasons of Game of Thrones, 4 or 5 seasons of Breaking Bad, we've had a lot of grimdark in our life, and I think we're ready for some, some happy-go characters getting what they're after.
Yeah, I mean, look at even Better Call Saul. Well, actually, I can't really speak to that, but certainly the guy who did Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad is
what
now
is his name? Goddamn.
He's
sorry, go on.
Sorry, Gillian.
No,
Gillian.
No.
Gillian.
I don't think
Vince
it's
Gillian.
I don't think it's Gillian.
Vince Gillian.
Vince. Anyway, he's
Vince Gilligan.
Vince Gilligan. There.
Yeah,
Gilligan.
Okay. Yeah.
So he's done Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, and you can see there's a trajectory that Better Call Saul is like a dark comedy. He's now going into a thing called it's based on a book by my favorite author. Oh my God, I'm blanking on the guy's name. I can't like him that much.
This is great.
Richard Russo. He's doing a thing by called Straight Man by Richard Russo, which is a straight comedy. It's just like an academic comedy. So you can even see with him, he's just like, well, look, maybe I've had enough of this. Maybe I want to kind of go a lighter track. And that's just one person. It's completely anecdotal. But for someone to go so deep into that and be like, yeah, I think I'm going to do comedy now, I think is a kind of an indictment on how taxing that might have been emotionally for him.
This is good. I think we've redeemed Grimdark. I think that's what we've done. It's gone from pejorative for misery porn to quote Phoenix, an important genre. And you know what? I'm convinced.
Paddy, that's where I write so slow. I'm basically waiting for the cycle to change. I'm waiting a few years, so
perfect.
Taking my time, biding my time.
And to close us out, Matan, I believe you have a very poignant quote based on today's subject. Is that right?
I do. Thank you, Paddy. I have a quote by George R.R. Martin, the writer of A Song of Ice and Fire, widely known as Game of Thrones, and he says this: "If I was a soldier going to war, I'd be pretty scared the night before the battle. It's a scary thing. I want my reader to feel that fear when they turn the page."
George Grimdark R.R. Martin.
George.
Fantastic.
The G is for Grimdark.
Yeah.
Nice.
Well, that's been our discussion of Grimdark, ladies and gentlemen. If you have enjoyed this discussion, there is something that you could do for us after we've given you all this sage-like knowledge, and that is leave a review and a like on your podcast player of choice. whatever you want to say in the review, that's absolutely fine. If you give us 5 stars, great. If you give 1 star, we'll understand and we'll forgive you. But that would really, really help us and help the algorithm to find us. In the meantime, that's been it. This has been Precipice Fiction for another week, and we will see you again next week.
I just want to say, if you are going to leave a 1-star review, treat it like Grimdark. Don't just have a good reason. Set it up. Give us some tension.
Yeah.
Give us something in your 1-star review, and then we'll understand.
Feedback sandwich.
Yeah,
That's all I'm saying. Feedback sandwich.
Yes, feedback
Listen
sandwich.
to our other episodes to know what a feedback sandwich is.
We've been Precipice Fiction, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks very much.
You're listening to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.